Hey everybody. So today we are going to be talking about agriculture practices to build soil fertility. This will be an overview of a bunch of different methods, and we'll be talking about what fertility is to start with. So what is soil fertility? Well, when we're talking about building soil fertility, what we're really talking about building is both the nutrients in the soil as well as the capacity of the soil to hold those nutrients and moisture in the soil. You can't really have one without the other. I suppose you could have the capacity to hold nutrients in the soil, but without nutrients, not all the nutrients maybe, but generally we're talking about both of them. You definitely don't want to have nutrients without the capacity to hold those nutrients in the soil. And when we're talking about capacity, what actually holds those nutrients in the soil, we're really talking about organic matter and building our humus levels. What is humus? Humus is fully decomposed organic matter. What is organic matter? It's broken down living things, mostly plants, could be animals and microorganisms too, mainly carbon. So a lot of times we kind of interchange soil carbon, soil organic matter, and humus as kind of all very similar things. So now let's talk about different ways to build fertility in the soil. Compost. Compost is one of the best known ways of building fertility and building humus levels in the soil. And essentially what compost is taking organic matter, usually waste, food scraps, lawn clippings, all kinds of organic matter waste, and decomposing it down into humus is really the goal. You're trying to make that brown, soft, rich, sweet-smelling earth substance that is not actually dirt. It doesn't really have any dirt in it usually. It's just broken down organic matter. It's a beautiful fertilizer and a soil conditioner. And so you're seeing that in some of these pictures. Top left is a barrel composting system like you can buy at lawn and garden stores. Top right is worms and vermicomposting, which we have at the school. Bottom left is a cold compost system. This is what I have at home, just a piece of a circle of wire mesh, and layering weeds from the garden and food scraps in it. In the center, you can see kind of common kitchen scraps. In the far right, you're seeing some finished compost after it's been sifted. Okay, so composting is really all about taking organic matter, usually waste products, and decomposing them down and making humus and making a fertilizer and a soil conditioner that we call finished compost. And we'll be talking more about compost later. Cover crops and green manures. So you guys do have some experience with this. You have turned in cover crops before. So what are cover crops? Cover crops are a plant, a crop that you grow specifically to feed the soil. So it can be any number of different things, but usually cover crops have a few things in common. They're usually vigorous producers of organic matter, which means they grow fast, they get big leaves, they kind of shade out the ground, and they overall just grow a bunch. They produce a bunch of leaves and a bunch of organic matter, a bunch of biomass, we call it. And then you're going to turn those at kind of at the peak of their growth, which is usually when they're flowering, but before they put any of their energy into making seed, you're going to turn that crop and chop it into the soil. You're going to incorporate it into the soil, and it's going to break down and decompose in the soil and basically make compost right there on the spot in the soil. The three major benefits that we talk about with cover crops are: one, they are covering and protecting the soil. This is why they're called cover crops. So they make a thick blanket over the soil. Their roots prevent erosion. Their leaves prevent the soil from drying out or getting impacted by hard rains or getting blown away by wind. So they're covering and protecting the soil. That's the first thing cover crops do. Second thing is they are feeding the soil. When you turn them in, that organic matter is breaking down and enriching the soil with humus and improving the soil's ability to hold water and nutrients. That's the second thing. And the third thing that cover crops do is they reduce weed pressure. Now, the way they do this is when the cover crops grow, they kind of shade everything out. And so cover crops are usually quick emerging plants that actually grow faster than the weeds can. So when you till the ground and plant cover crops, they're going to jump out of the ground, sprout and grow really quick, and really quickly shade everything out. Meanwhile, the weed seeds have sprouted also, but they're trying to grow under this really vigorous plant, and most of them will basically get shaded out and die. And those weed seeds will then be sprouted and dead and will no longer sprout after you turn the cover crop in. So it really shades out a bunch of weeds and kind of eliminates them from your seed bank, we call it, where all the weed seeds are in the soil. So they really reduce weed pressure. So those are the three main things that a cover crop does. Now we're going to talk about a green manure. Green manure is a cover crop that is also a nitrogen fixer. And in farming, it's, I think, exclusively legumes. So on the left, on the picture on the left here in the foreground, you see a bunch of those kind of pretty reddish strawberry colored flowers. That is crimson clover. That's one of the many leguminous green manures that you can grow. And the reason why legumes are different in terms of cover crops is because they are nitrogen fixers. So when you turn them into the soil, you're adding a significant amount of nitrogen to the soil, right? What else has nitrogen that we might apply to the soil? Manure, animal manure. So that's why they're called green manures, because it's a green plant that you grow, but it also adds nitrogen to the soil. So we have cover crops and then leguminous cover crops. If you grow a pure stand of a legume, like the crimson clover on the left, then we just call that a green manure. It essentially has the same three benefits of a regular cover crop, plus the addition of added nitrogen into your soil. Oh, one more thing about cover crops and green manures. Normally, these are grown in the off season. Now, you can grow them during the growing season if you really want to focus on building your soil, but normally these are grown in either over winter or late fall. Some of them, like the cover crop on the right that the tractor is tilling in, that is buckwheat, which is a very fast cover crop. So it can build some organic matter in the soil and shade out weeds in a relatively quick period of time. I think buckwheat takes about a month, and then of course you still got to wait for that material to break down before you're planting in it. But it's one of the quickest cover crops there is. But usually these are grown in the off season. Mulching. So the next fertility building practice is mulching. You guys probably all know a good bit about mulching. Mulching is essentially laying a layer over the soil, and when we talk about mulching, we're really talking about organic mulch, meaning organic matter. So mulch could be dried leaves, it could be grass clippings, either fresh or dry. It could be straw or hay, it could be wood chips. These are all forms of organic matter that are basically chopped up in some way, laid as a layer on the surface of the soil. Now, the three benefits that we get from mulch, the reasons why we mulch, is because one, it keeps weeds down. Just by covering the surface of the soil, it keeps those weed seeds from sprouting and growing, and can reduce the amount of weeding that you have to do really significantly. So that's the first one. Second one, it holds in moisture. If you cover your soil with a layer of mulch, like you can see in the pictures, the amount of watering that you have to do is significantly reduced, and the soil is protected. It's protected from the elements, from hard rain hitting it, from wind blowing it away. So there's also some erosion protection in there too. But the big one, number two, is it's holding in your moisture. And then the third benefit of mulch, specifically these organic mulches, is that they are breaking down and feeding the soil. So especially my favorite in the garden, at least, is grass mulch, which actually has a significant amount of nitrogen in it. So the drawback of that is that it breaks down more quickly. The mulch doesn't last as long, but it's breaking down and becoming fertilizer for your crops. All of them break down, but basically there's a relationship between how quickly they break down and how much nutrients they provide. The faster they break down, the more often you have to apply them, but the more nutrients they're feeding to your crop. Whereas longer term mulches like wood chips, they really don't provide much food, much in the way of nutrients for your crop. But on the other hand, they last a long time and you don't have to keep replacing them. One thing that I want to say about mulch, and the whole idea of mulching in general, is that when you have bare soil, like you can see in the far left side of the picture, nature always wants to cover that soil. And I don't want to anthropomorphize nature too much, but basically that is an open spot in the landscape. And what naturally happens when there's sunshine shining on bare soil is that you have seeds sprouting. Whatever seeds are in the soil, weed seeds in this case, they're going to sprout and they're going to grow, and they're going to want to take up that space and take up that available bare soil that nothing is growing in. They want the sunlight, they want the nutrients in the soil, and so something wants to grow there. When you're covering the soil with mulch, you are essentially taking away that weed pressure, and you're accepting that nature wants that soil covered. So when we're mulching, we kind of want to, if we want to work with nature, we kind of want to look at our garden space, our farm, the same way. And when we see bare soil, we want to cover it with something, either growing plants or organic matter or mulch. All right. That'll make our whole farming experience a lot easier. Now, talking about no-till. One other thing that I didn't mention when we're talking about mulch is the ability of mulched ground to stay, as long as there's not heavy compaction from a lot of foot traffic or a lot of machines driving on it, mulch will keep your soil soft and loose. Part of it is the organic matter breaking down and all of the microorganisms and the worms moving through that soil and keeping it actually aerated because there's so much life going on in the soil. Now we can take advantage of this when we in another farming method that is no-till or minimum tillage. And what this is rather than turning the soil, which is a time-honored tradition in our current form of agriculture, rather than turning the soil, pulverizing it, tilling it, and getting down to bare dirt before we plant, if we're careful and we're smart about it, we can actually leave the organic matter from the previous crop on the ground and cut it down and plant directly into the mulch from the previous crop, the stubble. And what the picture on the left that we're seeing is a large commercial farm that is doing no-till. This is actually a pretty popular method these days. And you can see the stubble, all of this dry material from the previous crop, and then they basically drove through with the seeder, with the seed drill, and planted the next crop in between the rows of the previous crop. And there wasn't a bunch of tilling and soil conditioning and several passes with the equipment. So it really saves the farm and the farmer a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of inputs, and a lot of time. And it just takes coordinating and planning things out right, having the right rotation. But this system is being used a lot in a lot of big farms now. It's gaining a lot of popularity. On the right side, you can see a picture, and this is more of a large garden situation. And they're essentially doing the same thing or something similar. And the difference between minimum tillage and no-till, it's like it sounds. Minimum tillage means that you're turning the soil as little as possible, but they both subscribe to that philosophy that you always want to keep your soil covered in mulch. And then you don't have to walk on it or drive on it nearly as much because you don't have to weed as much. So you're not constantly walking or driving through there with a cultivating hoe or weeding by hand because the ground is constantly covered with mulch. And anytime there's some bare dirt, you're going to bring mulch out and cover it with mulch. We can talk more about no-till farming if you guys are interested. Sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is a pretty cool way of turning an otherwise untouched or unused piece of land into a garden with very little effort. So sheet mulching, and I don't know if some of you have done this before, it's normally done with cardboard. So you can use cardboard boxes. You do want to get all the pieces of tape or any metal staples out of them and just have cardboard. And you usually want to put down a couple layers. Then you're covering that essentially with organic matter. Could be grass mulch. Wood chips are great. Wood chips are better. Dry leaves are great. Straw is great. Ideally, you want that organic matter to stick around for a while and not break down really quickly. So your more carbonaceous forms of organic matter like wood chips, dried leaves are generally preferred. And essentially what a sheet mulch does is you can take a piece of ground that is maybe a old garden that was covered in weeds, that completely got neglected, or a piece of your yard that is just grass that you want to turn into a garden. And rather than going through here and slaving away, tearing out every little chunk of sod, trying to knock all the dirt off of it, and in the process taking away a bunch of the nice topsoil and nutrients, and then having to dig that all up and plant it. Instead of doing that, you're just going to layer cardboard and organic matter on top of your soil, and you're going to wait. People usually do this in the fall, and by springtime, you can essentially Make little holes in your mulch and then dig down to the soil underneath, throw a little bit of compost or fertilizer in every hole and just start planting. And leave that mulch right where it is. And just start making holes and planting your plants into your sheet mulch. Now, a couple tricks with sheet mulching. It is good to lay down a little layer of some kind of a fertilizer, compost, a blend of fertilizers and compost underneath before you lay the cardboard down. So if you're doing it in a yard, you're going to sprinkle your fertilizer and compost right on top of the grass where you want to do your garden, and then you lay your cardboard on top of that. Second tip, water your cardboard. This system works best on flat ground, though you can do it on slightly uneven ground. But when you water your cardboard really well, you want to soak it. What that does is the cardboard kind of like lays down and sticks to the ground and really conforms to it better. And it gets rid of maybe some of the air pockets and things that would allow the grass and the weeds that are under the cardboard to kind of survive a little bit longer and be able to push up through the cracks in the cardboard and survive and pop out of your sheet mulch, which you don't want. Third thing, the thicker the better. Lay it on thick. Lay that mulch on really thick. Do a double layer cardboard. Out of sight, out of mind. The more you can bury all the grass and weeds under there, the more nothing is going to sprout up. It's all going to die, break down, and become fertilizer for your garden. And the fourth thing, which I already kind of mentioned, when that cardboard is broken down, when the grass underneath is killed, and you're ready to plant, you don't want to be incorporating this mulch into the dirt. You want to be pushing it aside and getting it out of the way and then digging a hole directly in the soil below all that mulch and planting into the soil. If you're incorporating that mulch into the soil, it's going to pull a lot of nitrogen out of your ground, which is not what you want to do. That's generally why mulches stay on the surface of the soil. Cover crops and green manures, that's something different. But when we're laying mulch, wood chips, grass, straw, leaves on the surface of the soil, we want them to stay on the surface and not get dug in the soil. The last thing I want to talk about is forest soil. Now, this is an ancient practice that was definitely used in Asia, probably used all around the world by traditional farmers for thousands of years. It requires a bit of kind of local knowledge about what trees produce good soil for what. Here in the Northwest, the red alder is the only tree that I usually harvest forest soil from under. You could probably do it from under big leaf maples. I can't think of too many other native trees that you're going to want to harvest soil from under for your garden, right? We don't want to harvest it from pine or cedar or fir or hemlock or any of those conifers. Now what I do is I'll go under the alder trees. I will rake away the leaves and the sticks on the surface, and I will take a shovel and basically skim off the top thin layer, or in some cases a little bit thicker, the top layer of that black, rich humus that has been accumulating there from all of the fallen leaves breaking down and being decomposed by the natural microorganisms in the forest. And I collect that material and I bring it back. I usually sift it to get the sticks out. And then I either apply that in my garden or I'll put that in my compost. It's a lot of work to try to use this material as your compost. But what it does do is it brings in some really good microorganisms into your composting system or directly into your garden beds, even in small amounts. Even harvesting a 5-gallon bucket every now and then brings some great biology, some good, healthy, beneficial microorganisms into your garden. And finally, When we are using all of these methods in concert, or several of them together in concert, what we can end up creating is gardens and farms that are incredibly fertile, where our soil is actually improving year by year instead of degrading, and where our time is spent doing productive things like either bringing in more organic matter, bringing in more fertility to our gardens, or planting and harvesting, rather than all of this time being spent weeding, watering, going to the store to get more fertilizer, weeding more, watering more. We can actually spend time doing things that are either making us money, feeding us, or building our soil's fertility and building the sustainability into our land. All right. Hope that was informative for you guys, and I will see you soon.